Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another one in our series of enterprise webinars. Hopefully you're logging on this morning to listen to our panel talk about cybersecurity. My name's Esther Carder and I'm very pleased to be hosting. Over the coming weeks, you can look forward to lots more topic discussions. Details of those are on our website and invitations obviously will be sent out in due course. If anybody's got any particular suggestions of any topics that they would like us to talk about, then please do email those suggestions in either to our general email address on our website or to your usual partner that you deal with. Now, I'm sure most of you probably are familiar with who we are. There's lots of regular names on our delegate list, but for those of you who are less familiar, Moore Kingston Smith is a top 15 audit, tax and advisory firm. We work with lots of different entrepreneurial businesses right across all different business sectors, as well as not-for-profit organisations and private clients. We're also part of More Global, which is an international network with a presence in over 100 countries. So cyber attacks and data breaches really have become a fact of life, and the level of sophistication that we're seeing these days is really quite scary, and the damage that can be caused has a huge impact on individuals and businesses. So today we're going to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that we've been recently seeing and how businesses can protect themselves against those vulnerabilities. So to put things in context, cybercrime has gone up 600% since the pandemic started, which is pretty staggering, and we'll be sharing some other rather staggering and scary statistics during our discussion as well. Now, it's natural also to think that our regular sort of business insurance protects us from the impacts of these types of attacks. But in reality, businesses really should be investing in specific cyber insurance, which offers much more holistic protection. Insurance companies are seeing claims for common threats such as typical data breaches all the way down to cyber extortion. So ensuring that you've got the right systems in place to mitigate these threats is really important. So we'll also be touching on the government cyber essentials. So today we are joined by Maritz Kloot, who is Director of Cybersecurity Services with More Clearcom. He's a highly experienced information and cybersecurity consultant and an integral part of the firm's digital transformation offering. He supports organisations of all sizes across a wide range of industries and helps to protect and identify their critical assets while becoming more resilient in the face of ever-evolving cyber and information security threat. He also implements standards such as ISO 27001 and ensures compliance with data privacy regulations such as GDPR. And before establishing his own information security consulting practice in 2010, Maritz worked as an information security and IT risk specialist within several large organisations. He's also a member of the Chartered Institute of Information Security and a certified information systems security professional. Lots of mouthfuls there, right. Richard Jackson, he's the partnership manager at More Clearcom and is a very experienced consultant holding a variety of industry qualifications in both cybersecurity and data protection, underpinned by a background in business analysis and project management. He's a regular webinar host and guest speaker at events such as AccountsX and HexCon. Rich is an advocate of the human element of cybersecurity and speaks regularly on the benefits of focusing on building a human firewall as a means of risk reduction and developing privacy-based business culture. Hopefully we'll have what that means explained to us later on. And last but not least, our guest speaker today is Duncan Sutcliffe. Duncan is a director of Sutcliffe & Co Insurance Brokers, which provides the insurance that comes with the government Cyber Essentials scheme. So a couple of housekeeping points. The webinar is being recorded. So please do share it with any of your peers who are unable to attend today or anyone who you think may be interested and to whom it is useful. Now, we're going to run today as sort of a Q&A session with the panelists. I have a list of questions, but of course it's much more interesting if you get to ask your questions as well. So please do pop your questions, and can I ask you put them into the Q&A function rather than the chat function? Much easier to keep track of everything in the Q&A function. So pop your questions in there and I will try to sort of weave them in as we go through the panelist session. So if the panelists would all like to just pop their cameras on and speakers on. Duncan, I think you're on you're on mute there. Maybe you're waiting for a question for you. But so we will kick off. So I think our first question is for you, Richard. So could you just give us some sort of sample data and statistics that really puts the sort of the current cyber threat into some context for us?
Yeah, absolutely, Esther. So what we're looking at on the screen now is some headline stats from a variety of sources collected over the last, I guess, 18 months, but very much sort of reviewed in the last couple of weeks to make sure it's up to date. And as you mentioned in the introduction, what we're looking at is a 600% uplift in cybercrime as a result of COVID-19. So when we talk about as a result of that, for a variety of reasons. So it's the nature of the pandemic and the sort of things that people might be interested in, or links they might click on the back of receiving emails, phishing emails that relate to items they may wish to purchase in the very early days of COVID-19, such as hand gels, that kind of stuff, or testing kits, but also predominantly because of the home working element and now the hybrid working, the fact that people are working from home. We're looking at by 2025, it's going to cost companies sort of $10.5 trillion, which isn't, it's a number that most of us probably couldn't get our heads around. And the really interesting stat for me, and I use this one a lot because in 2020, this was a stat that I was talking about, that by the end of 2021, cybercrime would be worth more than the entire global illegal drug trade. So we're now at that point. So I've kind of reached the point I've been talking about for quite a while. Pretty much 4 out of 10 UK businesses identified a cyber attack this year so far, which is a huge number if you talk about risk management and whether you need to insure yourself against that, as I'm sure Duncan will comment on. Phishing, for those of you who don't know what it is, it's when you receive a link in an email and you click, or it might come in a text, which we refer to as smishing. And this one's always difficult to quantify, but the average material cost that we're looking at for a medium to large business is around sort of £19,000 at the moment in the UK. So I'd kind of invite Moritz and Duncan to dive in on this one, and anything that stands out that you'd like to comment on.
I mean, just in our experience, that is really an average cost, but there's small costs and large costs in there. Some of the clients we've worked with sort of post-incident, and we'll talk a little bit about invoice fraud and how cybersecurity sort of plays a role in that. But there are companies that have lost hundreds of thousands of pounds as a result of an attack like this, where literally they pay out a contractor £600,000 in one shot, and actually that was a fraudulent invoice. So I think that 19,500 is probably because there's lots of little ones, but there are some bigger ones as well in there, and the average sort of hides some of that as well.
Yeah, I would agree. It's very hard to say that what a cost of a claim is. Some of them don't actually cost any lost money, but they're very disruptive in terms of time and effort and reputation. The largest claim that I'm aware of is $800 million, but thankfully we don't see those every day. Yeah, the size and number of claims is growing, and insurers are alarmed because claims were often at the smaller end, but there does seem a trend from criminals to go big now, unfortunately.
Definitely. And it is interesting that it's bigger than the global illegal drug trade. You don't think about cybercrime as a proper crime, but actually this shows that, I mean, there are so many major crime organizations that's got cybercrime now as part of their sort of as part of their armory as well. And also it's really easy to commit cybercrime. Actually, there's a lot of it's quite commoditized now in terms of being able to purchase either details of breached companies, so companies who manage to get their credentials phished, for example, that gets sold on through the sort of supply chain to somebody who then uses that to attack an organization. So it's quite a complex ecosystem now, but it's actually quite low level of entry to try and get in and actually commit some of these.
Yeah, it's very easy to be a hacker. You can just buy the tools or pay someone to do it for you, but let's not just assume that it's criminals attacking externally. You know, there was the Morrison's supermarket case recently where it was a disgruntled employee took action. And yeah, we also see plenty of cases of just things like laptops left on the bus or people sending confidential emails to their entire network by mistake. Simple mistakes can be just as damaging as malicious attacks.
Our DPO team is very familiar with the, oh my God, I've just CC'd 420 customers instead of BCC'd them, what do I do? And that happens a lot more regularly than people think, really, I think. And that's just simple mistakes as well. So yeah, absolutely, there's the cybercrime side, but then there's just the erroneous activities as well, for sure.
I think it's worth contextualizing it, isn't it? Because we talk about cybercrime, it's a phrase we use there, constantly every day in our field. But if you think about crime per se, and you've got the sort of the two ends of the scale where you've got organized criminal gangs, which run like businesses essentially, or you've got nation state threat actors, down to opportunists, and that's the same that we see in all areas of crime. We've got the opportunists to grab someone's handbag as they walk past, or you've got organized crime at that highest level. So this is on a sort of grand sliding scale, really. Yeah. Just a second slide on this. So what we're seeing, this is obviously really significant as well. We're seeing huge growth. So it's not just it isn't peaking. This is continual growth year on year, around 15%. And cybersecurity ventures, I think this is a quote from last year or possibly the year before, that it represents the greatest transfer of economic wealth in history. So that really does underline the significance of it. We'll touch on this, the lower part of this slide in more depth as we talk about insurance with Duncan, but the most common types of attacks that we're seeing are the phishing and social engineering attacks, compromised, stolen, or devices left where they shouldn't be, and the credential theft. So, I mean, Rex, in terms of that second bullet point, you're vastly experienced in cybersecurity. Does that kind of statement, how significant is that statement in a grander scheme?
Well, I think the sort of the volume, that's really spoken in terms of the volume of cyber attacks. So not so much purely just about the size of how much the cyber criminals can sort of monetize their attacks. But yeah, no, for sure, I can definitely see that in the industry as a whole.
Yeah. I think the two slides as a whole just underline the fact that every business, every organization has to now sort of factor this subject in as a given. It's not just something they might need to be thinking about. It's an essential, really.
And have the types of attacks changed particularly since COVID started? Obviously, we've sort of had that statistic about it growing by 600% since the beginning, but have the types of attacks changed?
Not from what I can see. I think it's just more. There's just more of them. So the typical attacks we see from our side is either ransomware, and again, it's a way that cyber criminals can get cash out of an organization quickly, because ultimately it's all about either stealing data or stealing money. So ransomware is where normally starting with something like a phishing attack, or potentially you've got services that have got vulnerabilities that they can technically exploit. Essentially, they encrypt all your data, but also what they do is potentially take copies of that data first. So they extort you based on the fact that they want you to buy the decryption key from them so you can decrypt the data and carry on with your normal business. But also often they extort you for, if you don't give them the money, they might release the information on in public. So they may have stolen a lot of customer data as part of the process of getting the ransomware installed. Or intellectual property, which is very much a big target for a lot of the more sort of advanced threats. And ultimately, it's all about then getting you to part with a reasonable amount of cash to be able to get that back. That's their aim. The second one is really business email compromise. So where somebody managed to get access to someone's email account. That person might be quite key. There might be a financial director, financial controller, they may be part of the supply chain. They'll spend some time once they get access to a mailbox to understand the workings of the business, and ultimately try and insert them into a transaction. So for example, if there's a big project, a building project going on, They will monitor for when invoices come in, for example, from suppliers, and then they will pretend to be somebody that's key within the process, and say, no, look, actually, our bank account details have changed. Here's a form to say that our bank account details have changed. Can you, rather than pay the invoice to this account, pay to that account? And if your business processes aren't strong to sort of deal with that sort of change, you can see they sort of start chaining a lot of vulnerabilities together to actually get you to part with your money. And once you parted with that cash and paid it off into the bank accounts, and you don't realize it fairly quickly, then it's really difficult to get that money back. And I imagine that's where the cyber insurance or the business loss insurance really comes in then. Who, Duncan, I don't know whether there's then further work to do by the insurance company to understand the incident and whether there was negligence and all that sort of stuff, and whether they pay out or not. But it might be interesting just to understand that actually from your side.
Yeah, interestingly or frustratingly, insurers look at cyber insurance and cyber crime often as two different things. Right. Which is frustrating because half of all the sort of cyber incidents that we see are invoice fraud. So in olden days, it would be done through the post. It's just now cyber enabled. Now, a cyber policy, cyber insurance will often exclude losses as a result of a fraudulent invoice that you've received by email. So in many cases, you have to actually request that as an additional or separate cover to your cyber insurance. And because it's so rife, it's a very expensive part of your insurance. So adding that on, could in some cases double the cost of your insurance or more, and they'll limit how much you can have because it's so easy for it to happen. And an example that was just a couple of years ago was Microsoft themselves fell foul of invoice fraud, and they spent $100 million, not 100 million, they spent $1 million buying computer equipment on fake invoices, and they lost it all. So yeah, it happens to the brightest. We see it all the time. It's horrible.
For sure.
Maritz, what are the sort of typical ways that businesses get compromised? You talked about sort of email fraud and invoice fraud, but what are the most common?
It almost always starts with a phishing email, and that's why phishing is so high on, because attackers, phishing is, you can send out a stackler of phishing emails, right? You can send out hundreds of thousands of phishing emails a day, and actually, in fact, a lot of internet traffic these days is spam and phishing emails. So it's quite a low cost way of trying to get to employees and staff, and most of them try and get credentials. So most of them will say, there's a file you need to download. It'll pop up with something that looks like your little Microsoft login. You'll put your username and password in there, and they've got your username and password. And if you don't have features like multi-factor authentication switched on for Office 365, all they can do is log into that person's email account. They do a few sort of key changes to the account to hide the fact they're there, like email forwarding. And then essentially they're in the organization. They can access everything that user can access on Office 365, and they can pretend to be that user. And from there, they can either send phishing emails to other people within the chain to try and get into their email accounts as well. So I think that really phishing is one of the key starting points, and it doesn't always get picked up by your spam filters. Sometimes the phishing exercise or the phishing emails are really clever, and it bypasses all these filters. And because it's not malware, it's not something dangerous, it doesn't often get picked up. And that to me is normally the starting point of attacks. I mean, other ways they also potentially can hack or get in is obviously through a lost device, but just having services on the internet available that's potentially got security vulnerabilities, because again, the chain works that there are hackers that specifically just look for vulnerabilities within companies, and they sell those vulnerabilities onto the real cyber criminals, and they make money out of selling vulnerable organizations or selling credentials, and essentially that then goes on to whatever those criminal organizations want to do with those accounts, whether that is ransomware, whether that is a business email compromise. But we've investigated some business email compromise, and it's absolutely mind-blowing that somebody can sit for a month within a network and really then start impersonating other individuals quite accurately, and also start creating alternative sets of documentation and hide the fact that they're doing it. These guys are experts in what they do. This isn't sort of script kiddies sitting there. They know exactly what they're doing. They're hardened criminals, and that's the ones we've seen. So to me, that's sort of that's probably the main issue we're seeing at the moment, over and above the sort of more traditional ransomware type attacks.
Yeah, the most common, and there's different ways that data can be lost, but the common link is human error or human weakness. And insurers are now increasingly asking that policyholders have annual or more often training for their staff in spotting things like phishing emails and general cybersecurity, because it's humans that let the nasty things in and the precious things out. And they're very clever. We had a case the other day where there's a father and daughter are the directors of a company, and the daughter received an email which appeared to be from her father saying, it's our financial year end today, which it was. Can you transfer X hundreds of thousands of pounds into this account before lunchtime, please? The only reason that she didn't was her dad walked past at the time, and she said, yeah, I'm just doing this for you, Dad. Very convincing. It was just one digit difference in his email address was the only obvious thing. They'd clearly been watching for a while and knew that the way they interacted and spoke, it was very convincing. But if you think about business in general, how do you go as a business or organization? How do you go about getting business? Well, you advertise. You send out mass marketing, shotgun approach, and you'll see that with some of the things that attack you. These emails you get from the Prince of Nigeria, they're scattergun approach, and they will pick up some people. But then you'll also get targeted sales, and that happens with the criminals as well. They'll go on to LinkedIn, Facebook, your own company website, and they'll find out information about you. And they'll say, oh, yeah, I've worked out who the financial director is. I've worked out who the accounts assistant is. I can see that the financial director is currently in the Maldives on holiday. I've done some bit of other digging around, so they can create an email to the accounts assistant that looks very convincing and can perhaps put a bit of urgency or importance to it. Might mention the dog's name because the dog's on Facebook. All these things create a very convincing email which convinces the accounts assistant to open that Excel spreadsheet or to click on that link or to forward a bit of information. It's a piece of cake.
I think the other thing also to highlight is the attackers are leveraging the fact that a lot of people work remotely and fully rely on email for running their business. And that's one of the biggest issues we've seen. The way fraudsters manage this is to get people to avoid to talk to each other. They literally force the urgency side, but they'll also really target people who they know work remotely, and therefore there's not that human interaction. And if your business processes are very much reliant on email, for example, for transactional stuff, and not so much one-to-one human interaction, then you're potentially vulnerable to this sort of attack, for sure. For sure.
I talked in the intro about the importance of the human firewall, and somebody's asked a question: how can we strengthen that human firewall? So I guess, in terms of the roles that people play and how they can, facilitate attacks and breaches, might be interesting to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, training. It's readily available. There is free training through organizations like National Cybersecurity Centre and Get Safe Online. And then there's this training that you can pay for as well. I was talking to Homebase, the DIY store. They instigated monthly training for every single employee, even the people that collect the trolleys, and it reduced the number of incidents hugely. And a lot of the incidents were just sort of the normal mistakes and errors that you get as well. So they found it invaluable. Insurers are starting to insist upon it.
Yeah, and I think it's not just the old, let's do a half-an-hour training session every year. It is very much an ongoing, you really should have an ongoing program of activities to keep people up to date with what the risks are, and just to remind them what they should and shouldn't do. And I think probably more than just your normal sort of end user, you also need to think about whether your system administrators or your IT service provider or your system developers have got sufficient understanding of security, so that they don't end up misconfiguring your systems, or they don't end up building software that's fundamentally insecure or potentially up to attack. So you do need to think about your people and what sort of training they need to be at the top of their game, because the attackers are at the top of theirs ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, an important thing is to ensure that cybersecurity and data protection is in the employee contract. So it is a dismissible offence if they do things that are silly, like using a USB stick to move or to take confidential data and put it on their own computer and so forth. So they understand the importance of that. But it's also important that they're on board and they understand the reason why it's so important, and that if they see something wrong, that they're not thinking, oh crikey, I better hide this because I'll get in trouble. It's, oh no, I've seen something wrong, I better quickly alert everyone because it would be awful if I don't. And so the first reaction of your colleagues should be, if they see something that's suspicious, is to alert people, not to hide it or ignore it or pretend it hasn't happened.
For sure.
And what, I mean, depending on the reason that the cyber sort of breach happened, does that impact whether insurance will pay out or not? I mean, what's insurers' general attitude to cyber threats and attacks?
Yeah, insurers in general have a bad reputation, but the vast majority of claims are paid. It's well over 95% of claims across all types of insurance. But there will be conditions within the policy. You know, if you have a home insurance policy, they'll expect you to have a front door, and they'll expect you to have a lock on that door. It's the same with cyber insurance. You know, there will be requirements. You know, they'll say, to apply for the insurance, you'll need a backup, firewalls, virus protection, patching, but more importantly, they're starting to ask for additional things like two-factor authentication, training, encryption of data that's on the move. And if you have a breach and you've said, well, yes, I have a backup, and then it turns out that you don't, well, it's like saying, I've had a burglary and I didn't have a front door. Yeah, 95% of claims are paid.
But is that where you have cyber specific insurance rather than 95% of claims getting paid on general insurance?
Yeah, general insurance policies won't cover cyber. Your car insurance wouldn't cover a fire in your house. Your business insurance will not cover cyber incidents. The cyber incidents are getting quite broad now. We've seen cases where businesses or buildings have burnt down because of a cyber attack. Now, a building's insurance would normally exclude cyber incidents. So hackers took control of thermostatic control systems, which caused fires. Insurance can be exciting and sexy, believe it or not.
It can indeed, I believe you. And what about paying out insurance claims if people have to pay ransoms? Is that covered?
Yes, most policies these days will cover ransoms. It's an ethically tricky one, because paying a ransom, you could say, well, it encourages criminality in the same way that kidnap. Do you pay that ransom? Well, I, as an individual, say, well, you shouldn't pay kidnappers ransoms, it's bad. But I know that if my dog was kidnapped, I probably would. If my wife and children were, maybe not. But ethically it's difficult, but the cover is there. Where it can become problematical is legally you're not allowed to pay money to sanctioned organizations. So for example, if you knew you'd been hacked by Russia, we wouldn't be able to pay that claim. But in reality, we don't know who's hacked you, because the criminals are very good at covering who they are. It could be the nation state. It could be just the boy next door. You'll never find out.
And has the world of cyber insurance changed over the last couple of years since since COVID? Has it been impacted by that at all? Or?
Yeah. Well, COVID has seen more working from home, which means there's more places to attack, because a business that has 20 staff now has 20 attack points rather than one. So and also the criminals are getting bigger and better, and the damage they're causing is getting vaster. So we're seeing insurance premiums go up. Premiums have doubled and more since COVID. Insurers are restricting the breadth of cover they're providing and the limits of indemnity they're providing. And it's harder to get. You're having to jump through more hoops to get cover. Insurers are looking closer at what you are and what you do. Traditionally, if you were in the medical sector, financial sector, data processing, or you had a lot of involvement with North America, it was harder to get insurance. Now it's very hard to get insurance, and they've also brought in other industries like the legal sector, education sector. They're really struggling to get cover because they've just been hit so badly by claims of late. They're targeted, or their infrastructure is weak. You think of the education sector. If a school with 1,000 children, that's 1,000 very bright, mischievous people with 200 teachers that are badly resourced, don't have cyber training, using IT systems that are out of date and not patched. So yeah, it's harder and more expensive to get cover.
Somebody's asked, what about the importance of company policies and contracts to allow the access of staff data for investigations following a breach? I don't know who's best placed to answer that one. Ritz, maybe.
That's a good question. I'm just quickly reading the question.
Yeah. I mean, it's you certainly should have your employee contracts and employee handbooks should have data in there, in the same way that they will have GDPR in there now. And you should. Yeah, if your staff are using mobile phones and laptops and stuff, ideally you want them using company ones, because the last thing you want is, for example, there's a potential breach and you want to wipe that computer clean. And that person has got their own personal photos of their family on there. It's going to be very difficult to say, well, I'm going to have to wipe your computer and all your children's photos. You want to separate work from home on your IT systems for so many reasons.
From a forensics perspective as well, if you need to do a forensic snapshot of that individual's computer in support of an incident, that's a massively complex area as well, because essentially you'll take a forensic snapshot of their personal life as well. So we always try and advise clients to try and avoid BYOD as far as possible, just because there's so many holes you can fall into as a result of that. Yes, it's easier from a work perspective, but if things go wrong, it's a really bad place to be in many cases if you haven't thought it through fully.
You talked about separating sort of work from personal, in that we had a sort of a similar webinar last week that was targeted towards sort of media clients, and we were talking a bit about passwords as well, the regularity, or rather perhaps not, with which you change passwords, and also about splitting those out between work and personal. Might be worth just touching on that today as well, I think.
Yeah, so I think the point we had last week was around everybody's got so many services online that they log into now, whether that's for work and for personal. And one of the things that should really be quite clearly specified in both security policies and security awareness is don't use the same password for everything, because sometimes people log in with their work email account to normal sort of like Facebook or eBay or whatever, and then they might use the same password they use for their Windows login, for example. So obviously, if those services are compromised, attackers know that people share usernames and passwords, and they'll use that in the next big attack on other services as one of the many thousands of passwords and usernames they try. And potentially they could get into your PayPal, they could get into the company's Office 365 as a result as well. So there's definitely a big awareness piece around using passwords that are strong but not shared, especially when it's different types of services you're accessing as well.
Obviously, there's that the point we were talking about last week as well, where it's with the fact that the vast majority of organizations still ask their users and employees to change passwords on a regular basis, which is no longer seen as a very good idea.
Yeah, there's that as well. Rather use more complex passwords and have a trigger to change it if you think it's been compromised, rather than forcing people to use password 123 and then 124 and then 125 every time they change it, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Duncan, when people are going out to look for sort of cyber insurance, will the insurer look for sort of evidence of these human firewalls or good technology to try and pick it up in terms of sort of risk mitigating to determine what the premium might be? And might they, in some circumstances, could they just refuse to insure at all if they didn't think it was sufficient?
Yeah, increasingly insurers are refusing to insure organisations, and that might be because they're in a sector that has been very badly hit. So the legal sector are finding it very difficult to get cover at the moment, for example. But yes, they will ask questions in the same way that when you're insuring your house, they'll ask basic questions. And for a small organisation that is low risk, they'll ask a handful of questions. For larger organisations, they will probe more, and they may actually get to the extent of surveying, doing penetration tests, actually visiting the site. So somewhere in between, but they will be reassured by the answers that you provide. And if you can show evidence of having accreditation to something like the government's Cyber Essentials scheme, or ISO 27001 and so forth, and you are doing all the right things, you are having two-factor authentication, training, encryption, and what have you, then they'll be more inclined to quote, cheaper and better levels of cover.
Well, that segues quite nice into a little chat about what Cyber Essentials is, because not everyone would have heard of this. I certainly hadn't before this morning.
Look at Duncan's face. Ah!
But then I'm not an IT person. I'm not in the IT department.
Yeah.
So
I'll give a quick intro to it, and then perhaps Marit or Rich will talk more about what the technical controls are. But it was introduced in 2014 by the government, and being introduced by the government doesn't mean it's rubbish. Sometimes they do good things. Their thought was that the country and organizations within the country are very vulnerable to cyber threats, and they wanted to increase the cyber hygiene of the country. So they introduced this standard or certification of technical controls, which will eliminate most of the common threats that are out there. And they launched it from GCHQ, National Cybersecurity Centre, saying that it will reduce threats to your organisation by 80%. And a University of Lancaster study actually said it's nearer 99%. And from my own experience, we insure close to about 10,000 organisations that have Cyber Essentials, and we also insure organisations that don't. If you've got 10,000 organizations, you'd expect thousands of those to have claims every year, or at least hundreds. Well, it's in the tens. Cyber Essentials is phenomenally good at reducing the threat to your business of cyber attacks, and it's relatively painless to achieve. So I'll let Marit and Rich explain technically what it is.
Yeah, so Cyber Essentials really focuses on 5 key areas. That's protecting your network perimeter. So if you've got access to the internet, to have technical controls, basic technical controls in place to stop people from getting into your network from outside. It's about malware controls. What do you put in place to make sure that your company doesn't get affected by malware? So anti-malware software, spam filters, all that sort of good stuff. It's about secure configuration. So how do you make sure that your devices are at least configured to a state where they're not vulnerable? And then a big part of it is security patching and making sure that your machines stay up to date with the latest security patches, because that's the kind of thing that attackers look out for. So those are some of the key technical aspects to look at. And it is quite a low bar in terms of security controls. But as Duncan said, those are the basic cyber hygiene factors. And actually, it's quite genius in that way because of how effective it was. Because if you look at ISO 27001, there's 140 controls. And what NCSC has done is really boiled that down into what are the technical controls that really make a difference. So certification to it is fairly cheap. And actually, I mean, you could argue whether you need certification or as long as you follow their standards, that's at least a good start. So at least adopt the standards within the business or adopt the scheme within the business, and then think about getting certified. But with certification potentially comes the cyber insurance that Duncan's Sutcliffe's offer as well, that you're eligible for that if you sort of fall into the right categories. And then obviously you can do Cyber Essentials Plus, which sometimes is required for contractual requirements, where it's more of an audited version of Cyber Essentials as well. But yeah. But I would say as a security consultant as well, working with a lot of SMEs, sometimes it feels like it's a bit difficult to achieve because you have to change the way you're working. You're not allowed to give people local administrator access to their own machines, for example, unless you've got good controls around that. So sometimes it requires a bit of organizational change and change in the way the business operates, but it is for the better. It is to make your business more resilient to the real commodity cyber attacks. So literally these spray and pray attacks, for example. So so that's my bit around cyber essentials.
Yeah, I mean, my bit we're sort of chipping in, I suppose, is also the commercial benefits of cyber essentials. Because if you're an organisation that's accessed or worked within government supply chain, for instance, or MOD, you'll be well aware that it's a prerequisite and it's a mandate in some circumstances. But what we're increasingly seeing is in generic business, for want of a better phrase, that it's becoming a requirement within procurement, tenders, bids, etc. That in order to protect the supply chain, the organisation which is putting work out to tender, for example, is requiring that all those that submit can prove their standards and commitment to cybersecurity, and there's probably no better or more sort of straightforward way to go about that, or more recognised than Cyber Essentials or Cyber Essentials Plus, which is why it's been included so regularly now. So I think if you don't hold Cyber Essentials, increasingly you're going to get to that stage of a process and discover that you need to probably get it in order to progress further.
And for your typical sort of, SME, is it a particularly onerous thing to go about getting, or are they likely to sort of tick a lot of the boxes already and it's just a case of tweaking?
It depends. It really depends on on how much time and effort has been spent on cybersecurity at that point in time. So really the starting point should be a gap assessment against the requirements, just to understand where you stand, and that will really define then what else you need to do. The extra bit that they've added to Cyber Essentials this year around is cloud access. So using Office 365, using Gmail. So they've put some really good controls in there in terms of helping you manage that and helping you be less vulnerable whilst using the cloud services as well. But yeah, for some organizations it's easy because their IT organization might be really security aware and therefore everything is really tightly configured, or they may be unlucky and they've not really spent any time thinking about how security works and they'll have big gaps. So it really varies from organization to organization, and it's not just small organizations that struggle to comply. Large organizations find it even harder sometimes because they have to scale those controls up to tens, hundreds, thousands of workstations and staff. So it is, but I would still urge saying that should be one of the minimum things you look at as a business. At least get Cyber Essentials and get certified if you can.
Conscious that we badge this as finishing at 10:45. I think we're just about there. We've got one more question I had come in, so if we just answer this one quickly, then we've answered everyone's questions. We have Cyber Essentials Plus and we have insurance included as part of the accreditation. Do we need separate cyber insurance?
Good question.
Yeah, the insurance that comes with Cyber Essentials is just £25,000 worth of cover, which will cover most of the small events that you might face. But realistically, I think most businesses, except the very smallest businesses, should look at increasing their cover. Now, you can increase the cover that comes with Cyber Essentials up to £250,000 for, I think it's just £224. So that's quite a cheap cost to increase it. But yeah, I would certainly have a conversation with your existing broker, or you can give me a bell. I'm happy to chat to you. But yeah, 25 grand cover would be eaten up very quickly if you had a nasty breach.
Yeah, it doesn't really protect from the sort of the nuclear breach, does it? Super. Right, we will bring it to a close then. Well, thank you very much, Moritz, Rich and Duncan, for joining us. It's been fascinating I've certainly learned a lot today, and I'm sure our delegates have too. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thanks, Esther. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.